You are standing in your kitchen, holding a jar of dried apples you made last fall. You open the lid, you smell it, and something is wrong. The fruit is soft, spotted, ruined. You did everything right, so why did it spoil? That question haunted me for 2 winters. Here is what I found. The difference between dried food that lasts 1 month and dried food that lasts 1 year is not the dehydrator, not the temperature, not the fruit. It is a single forgotten step that takes 7 days and costs nothing. And almost nobody does it anymore. I first noticed it in my neighbor Ruth's pantry in October when she handed me a jar of dried peaches from 3 years back that tasted fresh. 3 years. Mine barely lasted till Christmas, so I went digging. And the trail led me all the way back to a government pamphlet printed in 1918, buried in an agricultural archive that spelled out the whole thing in plain words. By the end of this, you will know it too. And you can do it this weekend. In the kitchen you already have, with the hands you already have. Let me take you back to that afternoon in Ruth's kitchen, because that is where the mystery really started. She was 91 years old. Her hands shook a little when she poured the tea, but her pantry shelves were lined with mason jars, dozens of them, full of dried apples and pears and green beans and tomatoes, and every single one of them was perfect. No mold, no soft spots, no waste. I asked her what her secret was. She just smiled and said, "Patience, honey. The drying is the easy part. It's what you do after that nobody remembers." I did not understand her then, but those words stuck in my head like a splinter. It's what you do after. What did that mean? I had a dehydrator. I had followed every instruction that came in the little booklet. I sliced my apples thin. I ran the machine for hours. I let them cool. I put them in jars. And still, every year, I would open a jar in the dead of winter and find fuzzy gray spots creeping across the fruit, and I would have to throw the whole batch in the trash. Do you know what that feels like? To spend a whole Saturday slicing and drying, to spend the money on good fruit, to fill your jars with pride, and then watch it rot? I was losing maybe $60 or $70 of food every single year. And worse than the money was the feeling that I was doing something wrong that I could not name. So I made a decision that October. I was going to figure out exactly what Ruth knew that I did not, and I was not going to stop until I had it in writing. Here is the first thing I learned, and it changed how I saw the whole problem. When you dry food at home, you cannot see the water that is left inside. Your apple slices feel dry to the touch. They bend and snap. They look done. But hidden inside those slices, the moisture is not spread out evenly. Some pieces come off the tray with almost no water left. Others, the thicker ones, the ones in the cooler corner of the machine, still hold far more moisture than you think. And when you seal them all together in one jar, something happens that no one warns you about. The wet pieces start sharing their moisture with the dry ones. The water moves around inside that sealed jar, spreading, settling, until there is just enough dampness in there to wake up mold. That is why my jars failed. It was never the drying, it was the sealing. I was trapping a hidden imbalance inside a jar and walking away, and 3 weeks later that imbalance became a science experiment growing on my peaches. But knowing why it failed did not tell me how to fix it. Ruth had said, "It's what you do after." There was a step between drying and storing that I was missing entirely. And to find out what it was, I had to stop asking my neighbors and start reading the old records. Because whatever this step was, it had been common knowledge once, and then it had quietly disappeared, so I started looking backward. And the further back I went, the more I realized how much we have forgotten. Here is what most people do not understand about drying food. It is the oldest way of keeping food that human beings have. Older than canning, older than the icebox, older than the refrigerator by thousands of years. Long before anyone had a jar or a freezer, people were laying food out to dry so it would carry them through the winter, and they were very, very good at it. They had to be. Their lives depended on it. The native peoples of the American plains made something called pemmican, dried lean meat pounded together with fat and dried berries. It could last for years without spoiling, without refrigeration, in a leather pouch. Years. Sailors carried dried food across oceans. Pioneers crossed the whole continent living out of sacks of dried apples and dried corn. These people had no thermometers, no electric machines, no instruction booklets. And yet their dried food outlasted mine by a country mile. How? What did they know that I did not? That is when I found something that stopped me cold. I was reading about home food preservation during the First World War, and I learned that in 1917 and 1918, the United States government launched a massive campaign to teach ordinary families how to dry their own food at home. There was a food shortage. The country needed to feed soldiers overseas, and civilians were asked to preserve every scrap they could grow. And so the Department of Agriculture printed instructions and mailed them out to households across the whole nation. One of those documents was called Farmer's Bulletin number 984, titled Farm and Home Drying of Fruits and Vegetables, printed in 1918. And when I finally got my hands on the contents of that old bulletin, I found the exact step Ruth was talking about, written in plain language over 100 years ago, for ordinary families with ordinary kitchens. But I am getting ahead of myself, because before I tell you what that bulletin said, you need to understand something that made me angry once I saw it. This knowledge did not just fade away by accident. Something replaced it, and that something has been quietly costing you money for 50 years. Think about it. Our grandmothers dried food because it was free, or nearly free. Sunshine cost nothing. A warm attic cost nothing. Drying food let a family take a bumper crop of tomatoes or a cheap bushel of apples and stretch it across an entire winter without spending another dime. It was the ultimate tool for people living on very little. And then, somewhere in the middle of the last century, we were sold a different story. We were told that the modern way, the safe way, the proper way, was to buy canned goods off the shelf, buy frozen vegetables, buy the freezer to keep them in, and then pay the electric bill to run that freezer every hour of every day for the rest of your life. We were taught to be a little afraid of the old ways, to think of them as primitive, unsafe, not quite trustworthy. But here is what nobody added up for you. A freezer full of food is only as safe as your power supply. One storm, one outage, one blackout that lasts 3 days, and everything in that freezer is gone. I learned that the hard way during an ice storm a few years back when I lost a whole freezer of food in a weekend. Dried food does not care about the power. It sits on the shelf, quiet and patient, needing nothing from you, ready whenever you are. Ruth's peaches did not need electricity. They just needed that one forgotten step. So who benefited from us forgetting how to dry our own food? The people who sell you the frozen bags. The people who sell you the freezer. The people who sell you the electricity to run it month after month, year after year. Every family that forgot how to dry a tomato became a family that had to buy one instead. And the old knowledge, the free knowledge, the knowledge printed in that 1918 bulletin was allowed to gather dust because there was no profit in reminding you of it. That made me more determined than ever to dig the whole thing out. Because if one step could make my food last a year instead of a month, what else had we lost? Now let me tell you what I found when I actually tested the old ways against the new. Because I did not just read about this. I went into my own kitchen and I proved it to myself, batch by batch, over 2 seasons. The first thing I tested was temperature, and this surprised me. I always assumed hotter was better. Blast the food with heat, dry it faster, get it done. Wrong. When you dry food too hot, the outside of each piece hardens and seals shut before the inside has had a chance to release its moisture. It is called case hardening. You end up with a piece of fruit that feels dry on the outside but is still damp and trapped on the inside. And you know what trapped moisture does? It becomes the mold spot on a jar in January. The old records were very specific about this. Slow and low. A gentle, steady warmth, somewhere around 125 to 140 degrees for most fruits and vegetables, with good air moving across the food to carry the moisture away. Not a blast. A breeze. The bulletin from 1918 described building simple drying racks where warm air could flow around every piece. They understood, a century ago, that moving air matters as much as heat. It is the air that carries the water away. I tested it. I dried one batch of apples hot and fast, the way I always had. I dried another batch, slow and low, with the trays rotated so every piece got even airflow. The slow batch was firmer, kept its color better, and, most importantly, showed no soft or sticky centers when I cut the thick pieces open. That alone cut my spoilage in half, but it did not eliminate it. There was still that final piece of the puzzle I was missing. Ruth's step, the thing you do after. And here is a clue that kept nagging at me. Ruth did not have a fancy dehydrator. She never did. When I asked her how she dried all that food, she waved her hand at her kitchen window and said the sun and the oven did most of it, same as her mother before her. That told me something important. Whatever her secret was, it did not depend on a machine at all. It was a technique, not a tool, which meant anyone could do it. Even someone with no dehydrator, no money for one, and no strength to lug a heavy appliance around. That brings me to the part of this I most want you to hear, and I am talking now especially to those of you who are thinking, this is fine for other people, but not for me. Maybe you are on a tight fixed income and the thought of buying a dehydrator for $80 or $100 is simply out of the question. Maybe your hands do not work the way they used to, and standing at a counter slicing fruit for an hour sounds impossible. Maybe you live in a small apartment with one window and no yard. I want you to stay with me, because this next part was put together for exactly you. This is where the old knowledge shines brightest, because the old ways were built by people who had almost nothing. If you find yourself asking that same question, I want to point you towards something I put together for exactly this journey. I wrote a series of guides called Start Smart and Deeper Roots, and if you want everything in one place, the complete system brings it all together, laying out the old preservation knowledge I uncovered, step by step, in plain language, the way that 1918 Bulletin was written for ordinary families. You can find the links in the description below. Now, back to the testing I did in my own kitchen. Because what I discovered about temperature alone was enough to change everything I thought I knew. You do not need a dehydrator. You never did. For thousands of years, people dried food with two things that are still free today: warm air and time. Let me show you how little you actually need. The simplest method costs you nothing but sunshine and a window. On a warm, dry day, you can lay thin slices of apple or tomato or herbs on a clean tray, cover them with a piece of light cloth to keep insects off, and set them in a sunny window or on a warm porch. Turn them once or twice. Bring them in at night so the evening damp does not settle back into them. Over a couple of warm days, they dry. That is exactly how the pioneers did it. That is how Ruth's mother did it. No machine, no electricity, no strength required beyond laying slices on a tray. If you have an oven, you have an even better tool, and most of you already do. Set your oven to its very lowest setting. If it will prop open just a crack with a wooden spoon in the door, even better, because that lets the moisture escape. Lay your food on a baking sheet. Let the gentle warmth do the work over several hours. You can sit in your chair the whole time. You do not have to stand. You do not have to lift anything heavy. You just check on it now and then. That is a full food drying operation for the price of a little oven warmth, using something sitting in your kitchen right now. And if slicing is hard on your hands, here is a trick from the old days. Many foods do not need slicing at all. Herbs dry whole, just hung in a bunch or laid flat. Small berries dry whole. Green beans can be dried whole after a quick blanch. Cherry tomatoes just need cutting in half, which even stiff hands can manage with a good knife and a moment of patience. You do not need to prepare a mountain of food. Start with one tray. One tray of dried tomatoes will flavor your soups for months. One tray of dried apples is a winter's worth of snacks. Small and steady wins this. The point I most want to drive home is this. The people who invented these methods were not rich. They were not strong young farm hands with fancy equipment. They were mothers and grandmothers stretching a tiny budget across a long, hard winter, using sunshine and oven, heat, and patience, because that was all they had. If they could keep a family fed with those tools, you can dry a few jars of food with them too. This was never a rich person's skill, it was a survivor's skill, and it belongs to you. But even with the sun, even with the oven, even with the perfect slow warmth, you will still open a spoiled jar in January if you do not do the one thing Ruth was talking about. the thing you do after. And I promised I would tell you what the 1918 bulletin said. So let me bring this whole trail to its end, because this is the piece that changes everything. Here is what I finally uncovered, and here is why it matters more than every other tip combined. After you dry your food, before you seal it away for the winter, there is a step called conditioning. That is the word, conditioning, and it is the single most forgotten step in all of home food drying. It is the reason Ruth's peaches lasted 3 years and mine lasted 3 weeks. It was written into that farmer's bulletin over 100 years ago, taught to a whole generation, and then quietly lost. This is what conditioning means, and I want you to hear how simple it is. When your food comes out of the sun or the oven, you do not put it straight into sealed jars. Instead, you loosely pack your dried pieces into a jar, filling it only about 2/3 full, and you leave the lid on but not tight. Then you set that jar on the counter, out of direct sun, and you let it sit for 7 to 10 days. And here's the crucial part. Once a day, every day, you pick up that jar and you give it a good shake. That is it. That is the secret. You shake the jar once a day for a week. Now let me tell you why this works. Because when I understood the why, I actually laughed out loud at how clever it was. Remember the problem. When your food comes off the tray, the moisture inside it is uneven. Some pieces are bone dry. Some pieces are secretly still holding water. If you seal them all up tight right away, that hidden water has nowhere to go and it settles into mold. But if you leave the jar loosely closed and shake it every day, something wonderful happens. The moisture in the wetter pieces slowly releases into the airspace inside the jar, and it evens out among all the pieces, and a little of it escapes each time you open and shake. Over a week, the whole jar comes into balance. Every piece ends up at the same safe, low moisture level. And here is how you read the results. Another trick straight from the old knowledge. During those days of conditioning, if you ever see even the faintest fog or beads of moisture forming on the inside of the glass, that is your food telling you it was not dry enough. The water is still coming out. If that happens, you simply put the food back in the oven or the sun for a bit longer, and then you condition it again. That fog on the glass is the warning sign that would have saved every batch I ever lost. I never knew to look for it. Nobody told me. It took a pamphlet from 1918 to teach me what to watch for. Once the week is up and the glass stays perfectly clear and dry, then and only then do you seal your jars tight for storage. And that food will last. Not weeks, months, a year and more. Sitting quietly on your shelf, needing no power, no freezer, no electric bill, ready whenever you reach for it. I tested this the very next batch. I dried my apples slow and low. I packed them loose in jars, lids resting on top. I shook them every morning while my coffee brewed. For the first 2 days I saw a faint mist on the glass, and I thought, there it is. There is the water I could never see before. So I dried them a little longer. Then the glass stayed clear. On the 8th day, I sealed them tight, and that jar sat on my shelf all winter, all spring, into the next summer, and when I finally opened it, those apples were as perfect as the day I put them away. Perfect, like Ruth's peaches. I had finally done the thing you do after. There is one more piece the old records taught me, and it is worth 30 seconds because it saves whole batches. Sometimes dried food spoils not from moisture but from tiny insect eggs that were already on the fruit before you ever dried it. You cannot see them. But the bulletins knew about this too. And there is a simple fix our grandmothers used with cold instead of a freezer, or that you can do with a freezer today. Before conditioning, you seal the dried food in a bag and put it in the freezer for 2 or 3 days. The cold kills any hidden eggs. Then you take it out, let it come to room temperature, and condition it as usual. That one extra step protects your grains and dried fruit from the tiny invaders you would never have spotted until they hatched. So there it is, the whole case, cracked open. The mystery that started with a spoiled jar of apples and a 91-year-old woman who said, "It's what you do after." The answer was conditioning. 7 days of shaking a jar. A step written down plainly in Farmer's Bulletin number 984 in 1918, taught to an entire nation during a war, and then allowed to fade away until almost nobody under the age of 90 remembered it existed. Ruth knew because her mother taught her, And her mother learned it in exactly those years when the whole country was drying food to survive. The knowledge did not die. It just went quiet, held alive by a few old hands in a few old kitchens, waiting for someone stubborn enough to go looking. I went looking. And now you have it too. Think about what this really means for you. You can take a cheap bushel of apples in the fall, or a garden overflowing with tomatoes, or berries on sale at the market, and you can turn them into food that lasts a year on your shelf for the cost of a little sunshine and a little oven warmth and 7 days of patience. No expensive freezer humming away and eating your electric bill, no boxes of frozen vegetables draining your grocery budget every single week, no throwing out spoiled jars and feeling like you failed. Just good food, kept the old way, the free way, the way that never once needed the power company or the grocery store to work. That is what got quietly taken from us. Not just a technique, a kind of independence. The ability to feed ourselves through a hard winter without owing anything to anyone. Our grandmothers had it. We were talked out of it. And today, in your own kitchen with your own 2 hands, you just took it back. You are the kind of person who does not swallow the easy answer. You saw your food spoil, and you knew somewhere deep down that you were not the problem, that there had to be a reason nobody was telling you. That instinct, that refusal to stop asking why, is exactly what led me to Ruth's pantry and that old bulletin. It is the most valuable thing you own. Never let anyone talk you out of it. Now I want to hear from you. Here is my question, and I am asking you directly, so please answer me in the comments below. When you dried food in the past, or when your mother or grandmother did you ever leave the jars loose and shake them, or did you seal them up tight right away like I always did? I really want to know how many of you were taught the conditioning step, and how many, like me, never heard of it until today. And tell me where you are watching from, because I would love to know how far this old knowledge is traveling. Leave a comment right now, even just one line. It matters more than you know. If this cracked something open for you, come join us. This is a place for people who are taking back the forgotten, practical knowledge that was quietly buried, the free ways of doing things that our grandparents knew and we were sold out of. Subscribe and stand with the rest of us who trust our own eyes and keep asking why. And I will tell you what I am digging into next, because it is another loose thread that has been bothering me for months. There is an old way of keeping eggs fresh for months without any refrigeration at all, a method farm families used before the icebox, written down in the same era as that drying bulletin. Everyone told me it could not possibly be safe, but the records say otherwise. I am testing it right now in my own kitchen, and when I have the proof, you will be the first to see it. Until then, go dry a tray of something, shake that jar for a week, and take back what was always yours. Now, this video showed you why your jars fail, but inside the Wise Living Circle, I pick up right where we just stopped, walking you through the conditioning step, jar by jar. And if something isn't clear, you can ask me directly, and a real person, me, writes you back. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel anytime.